The explosion came at 2:17. Not a rumble, a concussion. The kind that doesn't travel through air, but through bone. Staff Sergeant Ava Carter pressed flat against her platform 30 meters up, pine bark biting into her cheek, and felt the shock wave roll through the tree itself. Below, the relay tower's perimeter lights died. In her thermal scope, 12 heat signatures moving through the tree line. Disciplined, patient, not charging, probing. Then a crack split the air 6 inches from her scope housing. Counter sniper, already ranging her. Her earpiece crackled. Callahan's voice flat and certain. "Kid, that relay isn't just transmitting intel." A pause that lasted exactly 1 breath. "It's bait." The helicopter didn't land. It descended to 4 feet off the ground, held there with the kind of controlled aggression that said the pilots wanted to be elsewhere, and Ava Carter stepped off the skid into darkness. The rotor wash hammered pine branches overhead. Then the bird was gone, and the forest took over. Dense, damp, and absolutely silent in the way that forests are silent only when everything inside them is listening. She moved 30 meters into the tree line before stopping, knelt, listened, counted her own heartbeats until she reached 20. Nothing moved. That was the first thing wrong. A forward operating position in contested terrain should have some sound. A generator cycling, boots on gravel, the low murmur of comms traffic. What she heard instead was the particular quiet of a camp that had recently decided to hold very still. She adjusted the weight of her pack, 94 pounds she'd weighed it 3 times before insertion, and oriented herself by the faint smell of diesel exhaust drifting from the northeast. The relay station was 400 meters ahead. She covered that distance in 11 minutes, moving in the low, deliberate crouch that her first sniper instructor had called the old man's walk. She'd learned it at Fort Bragg, refined it in 2 deployments, and stopped thinking about it the way you stop thinking about breathing. It was just how she moved in the dark now. The camp materialized through her nods as a collection of angular shapes. 2 canvas structures, a comm tent, a fuel cache under tarpaulin, and at the center, the relay tower. 40 feet of telescoping aluminum, anchored with 4 guy wires, topped with a cluster of antenna arrays and a small satellite dish that tracked automatically, pivoting every few minutes with a soft, mechanical whir. A young corporal named Reyes met her at the perimeter wire. Staff Sergeant Carter, he didn't salute, good field discipline, but he looked relieved in a way that made her immediately uncomfortable. "We've been expecting you since 2100. Weather pushed the insertion window. She scanned the camp without appearing to. 6 personnel visible, fortifications minimal. The perimeter wire was single-strand concertina, barely enough to slow someone down. "Where's the Israeli team?" "Inside the comm tent. They arrived 6 hours ago." Reyes hesitated. They brought their own equipment." "Of course they did." She noted the hesitation, filed it. The camp was too quiet and too small for the asset it was protecting. Someone in the planning chain had either underestimated the threat or deliberately kept the footprint light. Neither option felt good. She checked in with the duty officer, dropped her pack, and walked the perimeter alone before doing anything else. It was a habit, a ritual really, that she'd developed after her second deployment. You learn a position with your feet before you trust it with your life. She measured distances, identified fields of fire, located the dead ground where an approach could be made without exposure. She found 3 of them. 3 separate approach vectors where a small element could move to within 50 meters of the perimeter wire without being detected by the current sensor array. She marked them mentally and said nothing to Reyes, because the time to address a security vulnerability is after you understand why it exists, not before. On the north side of the perimeter, she stopped, looked up. The forest canopy was dense enough to defeat aerial thermal surveillance at altitude. Good for them, also good for anyone moving through it toward them. The trees here were old-growth pine, 60 to 80 feet, with interlocking crowns that would scatter heat signatures into noise. Her own thermal would be degraded above 30 meters. She noted the wind direction, east-northeast, 4 to 6 knots, and cataloged the way it moved the upper branches in slow, hypnotic arcs. She selected her overwatch position before she went to sleep. The oak on the northeast corner of the perimeter, 30 meters up, with a natural platform where 3 large limbs forked from the trunk. Clear sight lines to the north and east. Partial coverage west. It was the best available option, which meant it was also the most obvious one, which meant she'd need to complicate that before first light. She slept 3 hours in the comm tent, on her pack, fully dressed. She dreamed about nothing, which was how she preferred it. The Israeli intelligence officer's name was Tamir, and he had the particular economy of movement that Ava associated with people who had been shot at enough times to stop wasting energy on things that didn't matter. He walked her through the relay system at 0600, when the forest was still gray and the dew was heavy enough to beat on the antenna arrays. The tower functions as a bridging node, he said, in English that was precise and slightly formal. Drone feeds from 3 UAV platforms route through here. Satellite uplink to our intelligence services in Tel Aviv, and a secondary feed to your 6th Fleet assets in the Eastern Mediterranean. He indicated the dish at the top of the tower. Without this relay, all 3 feeds go dark. We lose situational awareness across a 200-kilometer operational arc. How long has it been active? 11 days. And threat assessment? Tamir's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. The Iranians know it exists. They've been running proxy elements in this sector for 3 months. We assess they'll attempt to neutralize the tower within the next 72 hours. Which is why I'm here. Which is why you're here. Ava walked the tower's base, running her eyes over the hardware. The main antenna cluster was standard military spec. She recognized the encryption modules, the frequency hop transmitters, the hardened data drives bolted to the tower's 2nd tier. Then she saw something that didn't fit. A secondary data conduit, a single fiber run, separate from the main cable bundle, running from the tower's base into a junction box that was padlocked and unmarked. The conduit was new. The junction box was new. The padlock was a commercial brand, not military issue. She looked at it for 2 seconds, then looked away. Encryption protocol? She asked. Standard Joint Task Force parameters, Tamir said. Updated daily. Key rotation schedule? A fractional pause. Every 48 hours. That was wrong. Standard JTF protocol rotated every 24 hours in a contested environment. Either Tamir didn't know, or the standard protocol wasn't being followed, or the relay was operating under a different set of rules than the ones she'd been briefed on. She filed it next to the unmarked junction box and the 3 approach vectors and said nothing. I'll need access to the tower maintenance logs, she said instead. Of course. Tamir handed her a tablet. Everything is documented. She scanned the logs while he watched. They were clean. Too clean. No anomalies, no signal degradation events, no routine maintenance flags. 11 days of operation in a field environment and not a single logged irregularity. She handed the tablet back. Good system, she said. Tamir nodded, satisfied. She climbed to her overwatch position and began preparing it for the night ahead. At 1340, the first civilian appeared. Ava was running a range card from her overwatch platform, measuring distances to terrain features, calculating angles, building the mental map she'd need when the shooting started, when movement in her scope caught her attention. A figure 600 meters north, moving along a ridgeline trail. Then another, and another. She counted 7 people before they dropped below the ridge. Civilian dress, no weapons visible, no tactical gear. 2 appeared to be women. One was carrying what looked like a large basket. She keyed her radio. Actual, overwatch, civilian movement on the northern ridgeline. Grid 4, 4, 7-221. 7 personnel, mixed gender, no visible weapons, moving east. The duty officer's voice came back immediately. Copy, Overwatch. That trail is a known civilian route between 2 villages. Intel assessed it as low risk. Who assessed it? A pause. Joint Task Force Intelligence Summary, dated 3 days ago. Ava held her scope on the ridgeline after the figures had disappeared. 3 days was a long time. The tactical situation in this sector changed faster than that. She marked the trail on her map and noted the time. The problem with civilians in a combat environment wasn't the civilians themselves. It was the way their presence could be used, as cover, as camouflage, as human intelligence for the other side. 7 people on a ridgeline trail could be exactly what they appeared to be. Or they could be a reconnaissance element gathering information about the camp's layout, personnel count, and defensive posture while carrying baskets to make sure nobody looked too hard. She mentioned this to Reyes when she came down for her evening meal. "I know," he said quietly. "I flagged it 2 days ago. Intel said not to worry about it." "Which intel?" He shrugged. "Came from above my pay grade." Ava ate her MRE without tasting it. The civilians bothered her less than the fact that someone had decided they didn't need to be investigated. In her experience, the things that commanders decided weren't worth worrying about were exactly the things that killed people later. She went back up to her platform before dark and settled in for the long watch. It started at 2043. She noticed it first in the subtle behavior of the satellite dish. A slight, irregular oscillation that wasn't consistent with its normal tracking pattern. The dish would pivot 2 degrees, correct, pivot again. Like it was searching for a signal that kept moving. Then her radio went to static. She tried the backup frequency. Static. Switched to the emergency channel. Static. She climbed down from her platform in controlled haste and moved to the comm tent. Inside, 2 technicians were working their equipment with the focused urgency of people who had just watched something go wrong in a way they didn't fully understand. "What's the status?" she asked. "Jamming," the senior tech said without looking up. "Broad spectrum. Hit us about 90 seconds ago. Everything above 50 megahertz is down." He pulled off his headset, including the drone feeds. "How localized?" "Hard to say without the drones." He pulled up a frequency analysis display. "But the jamming pattern is..." He stopped, studied the screen. "Huh. What?" "It's not random noise jamming. It's targeted. Someone is hitting our specific frequencies." He looked up. "They know our comms package." Ava processed that. A random insurgent element didn't know their specific frequency allocation. That information was classified at the mission planning level, which meant either the mission had been compromised before she'd inserted, or the jamming was being generated by someone with access to their operational parameters. Her earpiece crackled. Then, through heavy static, Callahan's voice. "Ava." She stepped outside the tent. "Go ahead. I've been watching your signal from the outside. Someone's probing your position." His voice was measured, but she could hear the edge underneath. He'd taught her to listen for that edge. Not attacking, probing. They want to know how you respond. "Intel recon." "That's my read. They're mapping your reaction patterns." A pause. "Be boring, don't do anything interesting." "Copy that." She almost smiled. "Boring, got it. How's the tower looking?" "Clean on the surface." She kept her voice neutral. "Some things I want to take a closer look at when I get the chance." A silence that lasted exactly long enough to tell her he'd understood. "Don't rush it," he said. "Let them show you what they want you to see first." The jamming lifted 47 minutes later, as suddenly as it had started. The satellite dish reacquired its lock within seconds. The drone feeds came back online. The technicians ran diagnostics and found nothing wrong with their equipment. The camp went back to its cautious routine. Ava went back to her platform and spent 2 hours thinking about the things she'd seen and the things that didn't fit. They came at 0114, Not from the north, where the civilian trail ran along the ridgeline. Not from the east, where the terrain offered the most cover. They came from the west, through the dead ground she'd identified on her first perimeter walk. The approach vector she'd marked and said nothing about. She was already watching it. The first figure emerged from the undergrowth 200 meters out, moving in a low crouch, good fieldcraft, not rushing. Behind him, two more. Then another pair flanking left. She counted 8 in the initial element, guessed there were more she couldn't see. "Contact west," she said into her radio, her voice flat and unhurried. 8+ personnel, 200 meters, approaching the wire. Weapons confirmed. Below, the camp came alive with controlled urgency. The sound of safety catches coming off, position assignments being called, Reyes moving the perimeter team into cover. She let the lead element close to 150 meters. Then she shot the first man. The .300 Win Mag cycled smoothly, the suppressor dropping the report to a sharp mechanical crack that the forest absorbed before it traveled far. She worked the bolt, shifted her aim, shot the second man at the left flank position. The element reacted, dropping, seeking cover, returning fire toward the tower perimeter rather than toward her. Good. They didn't know where she was. She took her time and shot a third man who had positioned himself behind a fallen log and was preparing to fire an RPG at the tower base. The engagement lasted 4 minutes, then it stopped. Not a retreat, a withdrawal. Organized, deliberate, covering each other as they pulled back. She watched them go through her scope and noted the discipline of the movement. These weren't local militia. They were trained, and they hadn't tried to take the tower. She keyed her radio. "Callahan, I saw the contact report. 3 down, element withdrew." He paused. "They didn't push." "No. They were measuring something." "That's what I think." She kept her scope on the western approach, watching the darkness. "They weren't trying to take it. They were timing our response." "How long from your first shot to when they pulled back?" She checked her watch. 4 minutes, 12 seconds. Callahan was quiet for a moment. "Someone's building a tactical picture. They know the tower is defended. Now they know how it's defended." Another pause. "And they know how long it takes you to react." She said nothing to that because there was nothing useful to say. 3 men were dead in the undergrowth west of the perimeter wire. The relay tower was intact. By every measurable standard, the engagement had been a success. She didn't feel like it had been a success. It happened at first light. She was running a post-contact scan, working her scope methodically through the western approach to confirm the withdrawal was complete, when the antenna housing on the tower's second tier moved. Not the wind, not vibration. A single 8mm divot appeared in the aluminum housing as if punched from the inside. And half a second later, the sound of the shot reached her. A flat, distant crack from the northeast, 600 meters, possibly 700. She didn't move. The instinct was to drop, to seek cover, to react. She overrode it. Moving would give away her position. She controlled her breathing and held absolutely still and let her eyes work. Northeast. Dense canopy. The shot had come from elevation. The angle of impact on the antenna housing told her the shooter was above the forest floor, probably in the trees. The sound signature suggested a suppressed rifle, medium caliber. Not a heavy anti-materiel weapon. A sniper, working alone. She studied the northeast quadrant for 3 minutes without moving. The canopy was thick enough that thermal would fragment into noise, and the wind was moving the upper branches in patterns that would complicate any shot she tried to take. She couldn't locate him. Not yet, but she could read what he'd done. He hadn't shot at her. He'd shot at the antenna. She thought about that. From 600 to 700 meters, with the visibility conditions this morning, hitting a person-sized target in a tree platform was difficult but achievable for a competent marksman. Hitting a specific 4-inch component on a tower was harder. He'd chosen the harder shot deliberately. He didn't want to kill her. He wanted to degrade the relay. She filed that as the first behavioral signature. Then she thought about the timing. The contact from the west had ended 4 minutes and 12 seconds before she'd logged it and called it in. The shot at the antenna came 8 hours later, at first light, when visibility improved enough to attempt precision work at that range. He'd waited through the entire night, motionless in the trees. That level of patience wasn't tactical necessity, it was preference. This was someone who defaulted to stillness, who chose the long wait over the easier shot. Second signature. She replayed the antenna impact in her mind. The divot was clean, the shot precise, but the housing itself was still functional, damaged cosmetically, not structurally. A round at that velocity into the actual antenna element would have killed it. He'd hit the housing. A warning, or a message. Third signature. He was disciplined enough to deliver exactly the effect he intended. No more, no less. She keyed her radio. "Callahan, we have a counter-sniper. Northeast, 600 plus meters. Elevated position. Single shot, suppressed, hit the antenna housing. Kill shot? No, he had the angle for a body shot, took the equipment instead." A long pause. When Callahan spoke again, his voice was careful. "He's been up there a while." "That's what I think. Before you arrived? Maybe." She let that settle. If he'd been in position before her insertion, he'd watch the camp come online, watch the Israeli team arrive, watch the relay tower go active. He hadn't acted then, he'd waited. "He knows what he's doing," Callahan said. "Yes. And he's letting you know he knows." She said nothing because Callahan had already said the important thing. The enemy wasn't trying to destroy the relay, not yet. Like the probe from the west the night before, this felt like the opening move of something that required her to be present and reactive. He needed her here, watching, responding. She just didn't know why yet. She went into the relay's maintenance interface at 1600 during the hottest part of the afternoon, when thermal distortion degraded observation and the camp settled into its midday lull. The maintenance logs Tamir had shown her that morning were clean, but the maintenance interface itself was a different system. The raw operational layer, below the logging interface, where the actual data traffic lived. Tamir had given her read access to the logs. He hadn't given her access to the operational layer. She had it anyway. The access credentials were in the technical package her unit had provided before insertion, standard for a protection detail on a classified asset. Whoever had prepared the package had included full system access without flagging it as unusual. She plugged her diagnostic tablet into the hardline port at the tower base, used the secondary credentials, and watched the data traffic scroll. For 60 seconds, it looked normal. Drone telemetry, satellite uplink traffic, encrypted communications packets routed to the 6th Fleet node. Then she saw it, the secondary data conduit, the one she'd noticed that morning, the unmarked fiber run to the padlock junction box, was active, transmitting. And what it was transmitting was not drone telemetry or encrypted communications. It was coordinate data, specific, formatted, strike package coordinates, the kind of data that fed directly into a targeting system for an airstrike. She pulled the coordinate string and ran it against her mapping software. The numbers resolved to a location 14 kilometers northeast, a valley she didn't have on her tactical map. She zoomed in using the tower's satellite feed and found a cluster of structures, small buildings, a water tower, a road, a village. She ran the coordinates again, certain she'd made an error. The numbers came back the same. The relay was broadcasting targeting coordinates for a populated village to a system she couldn't identify from the traffic headers. Not to the 6th Fleet, not to any node in her mission briefing. Somewhere else. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she called Callahan. "I need you to run a coordinate check for me," she said, keeping her voice flat. "Off the books." She read him the numbers. The silence on the other end lasted longer than she liked. "Ava," he said finally, "where did you get these?" "The relay." Another silence. "That's a civilian settlement. There are people there." "I know." "Who's the targeting data going to?" "I can't trace the destination node. The headers are stripped." She paused. "But it's going somewhere active. The transmission is live and the data is current." She heard Callahan exhale slowly. It was a sound she recognized, the sound he made when something confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying and wished he'd been wrong about. "Something is using that relay," he said, "to set up a strike on a civilian target." "Yes. And someone in the chain put you here to protect the tower while that happens." The words landed like a second detonation, slower than the explosion that had opened her night, but heavier. She looked up at the relay tower, 40 feet of aluminum and encrypted hardware, humming quietly in the afternoon heat, transmitting its careful, precise lie to somewhere she couldn't see. "What do I do?" she asked. Callahan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality it got when he was choosing words with care. "Right now? Nothing. You don't have enough yet." A pause. "But start thinking about what you're willing to do when you do." She didn't sleep that night. Not because the forest was loud. It wasn't. After the first contact engagement, everything had gone quiet, in the way that terrain goes quiet when the people moving through it have decided to be careful. The probe from the west had told them what they needed to know. Now they were recalibrating. She sat in her platform 30 meters up and thought about the man in the trees to the northeast. 3 behavioral signatures. No kill shot when he had the geometry for one. 8 hours of motionless patience. Precision controlled to deliver exactly the intended effect. She turned these facts over in her mind the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath. And what she kept coming back to was the same question. What does a sniper who doesn't want to kill you want? He wanted the relay degraded, not destroyed, degraded. He'd hit the antenna housing, not the element itself. The tower was still functional, which meant he needed it functional. At 0340, he moved. She didn't see him. She felt the displacement, a shift in the weight of the darkness to the northeast, the way the upper branches stopped moving in a sector where the wind should have been moving them. It was the kind of awareness that couldn't be taught directly, only accumulated through enough hours in elevated positions until the forest's normal rhythms became automatic and the deviations registered as physical sensation. He was repositioning, moving from his original high to something closer or with a different angle. She stayed absolutely still and tracked the absence of movement through the canopy, building a picture from negative space. He was disciplined, each move brief, deliberate, with long pauses between. But she had one advantage he didn't know about. She'd been watching that sector since last light, and she knew the baseline. Every deviation was visible to her even when he was invisible. He stopped 480 meters out, elevated, different tree, different angle. Now he had coverage on the tower's eastern face, which her previous overwatch position hadn't fully covered. He was closing the gap on the relay's blind spots. She spent 20 minutes deciding whether to shift her own position in response. Moving meant he might detect her. Staying meant he would continue mapping the tower's defensive geometry. She stayed. Let him build his picture. Every choice he made told her something. At first light, he shot again. The round hit the tower's eastern antenna array, the frequency hop transmitter housing, with the same precision as before. Clean impact. Cosmetic damage. The transmitter was still operational. He was working methodically through the antenna cluster. Not destroying it, marking it. She keyed her radio, keeping her voice below a murmur. Callahan, he shot again, same pattern. Equipment hit, no structural damage. Which component? Eastern frequency hop housing. A pause. He's mapping the array. That's my read. Not for destruction, Callahan said, for interference. If you know exactly which components are where, you can place a jammer to target specific functions without killing the whole system. Another pause. Someone wants the relay to keep transmitting the coordinate data but lose its legitimate functions. She thought about that. A targeted jammer that knocked out the legitimate drone feeds and satellite uplink while leaving the secondary data conduit, the unmarked fiber line, active. The relay would look dead to everyone watching from outside. The coordinate transmission would continue uninterrupted. He's working for whoever set up the secondary conduit, she said. Or against them, Callahan said. Or both. Don't assume you know whose side he's on yet. She held that thought and watched the canopy and waited for the next move. By the second day, she had a partial profile. He shot twice in 24 hours, once at dawn, once in the late afternoon when the lights shifted, and created a specific glare pattern on the antenna array that he was apparently using as a reference point. Each shot was between 480 and 520 meters, never closer. He was staying outside what he'd assessed as her comfortable engagement range, which told her he'd done research on U.S. Army sniper qualification standards. He'd underestimated her by about 200 meters. She didn't correct that impression. Between shots, he was invisible. She tried thermal twice. The canopy fragmented his signature into ambient noise above 40 meters. She tried tracking muzzle flash. His suppressor was good enough that there was no secondary flash signature at that range. She tried listening for brass ejection. The time delay and wind made it useless. What she had was geometry. Every shot came from an elevated position within a 30-degree arc to the northeast. The angular variation between shots told her he was moving between at least 3 separate hides, all within roughly a 60-meter radius. She triangulated the probable center of that radius, a dense cluster of old-growth pine on a slight ridge elevation, 490 meters out, and she was reasonably certain that was where he staged between positions. She couldn't see him there, but she knew he was there. Reyes brought her food at midday and crouched beside her platform base while she ate. "Command is asking for a status update on the counter sniper," he said. "Tell them he's active, position unconfirmed, no casualties. They want a timeline for neutralization." She looked at Reyes. He was 23, competent, earnest in the way of someone who hadn't yet learned that competence and earnestness weren't always compatible with survival. "Tell them I'm working it," she said. "They're not going to like that." "No." She handed him the empty ration wrapper. "They're not." After he left, she thought about what she hadn't told Command. She hadn't told them about the coordinate data in the relay. She hadn't told them about the unmarked junction box. She hadn't told them that the enemy snipers seemed to be working in deliberate patterns rather than attempting a kill, which suggested a more complex operational picture than the threat assessment described. She hadn't told them because she didn't know yet who in the command chain to trust with that information. Callahan had been right. Sometimes the mission isn't the mission. She went back to watching the Northeast Quadrant and thinking about the man who was simultaneously her enemy, her problem, and possibly the only other person in this forest who understood what was actually happening. At 1640, he shot a third time. This one was different. Instead of the antenna array, the round hit the padlocked junction box. The commercial padlock shattered. The junction box door swung open on its hinges. She stared at the open box for a long moment. He'd just exposed the secondary data conduit. For anyone walking past the tower base, the fiber run was now visible, the physical evidence of the unauthorized hardware. He wasn't mapping the array for a jammer. He was showing her something. Tamir found her at 1800. He came to the tower base to inspect the junction box damage, and his reaction told her more than anything he said. He didn't look surprised. He'd been standing at the far end of the tower base for nearly a minute before he approached her. She'd seen him from the platform, watching the open junction box from a distance, not moving. A man deciding something. When he finally walked over, his hands were in his pockets, and his pace was unhurried, the way people move when they've already made a decision and are walking toward its consequences. He looked at the open box for 3 seconds. He didn't look surprised. He looked at the open box for 3 seconds, long enough to assess, not long enough to react, and then looked up at the antenna array where the morning shots had left their precise marks. "Your counter-sniper is effective," he said. "He's not trying to destroy the array." "No." Tamir ran his thumb along the edge of the open junction box. "He's not." She watched him. "You know what's in that conduit?" It wasn't a question. He understood that. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the open box with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not quite guilt, not quite calculation, something between them. "The strike package," he said finally, "has been authorized at a level above my operation. I was told the targeting data was validated." He paused. "I was told the structure at those coordinates was an Iranian command node." "It's a village, Tamir." "I know that now." He said it without flinching, which she respected. "I've been trying to pause the authorization for 6 hours. The response from my chain is that the intelligence is confirmed, and the strike window is in 31 hours. She processed that. 31 hours. Who validated the targeting data? A contractor intelligence service, American. He met her eyes. The same company that installed the secondary conduit. There it was. A private intelligence contractor had installed hardware in the relay that generated fake targeting coordinates, routed the data through the tower to make it look like it came from legitimate U.S.-Israel joint surveillance, and fed it up to an Israeli strike authorization chain. The relay wasn't just bait for insurgents, it was the mechanism. "Why?" she asked. Not rhetorically, she genuinely wanted to know what he knew. "The valley at those coordinates is 12 kilometers from a proposed pipeline route." Tamir said it flatly, like a man reciting a fact he wished he didn't know. "An escalation event in this sector, a significant strike, casualties, international attention, reopens the argument for expanded U.S. military presence in the region, which benefits certain parties with interests in that infrastructure." She stood with that for a moment. Men and women who would never come within 500 kilometers of this forest, making decisions in offices and boardrooms, and a village 14 kilometers northeast that had no idea what was coming. "You have 31 hours to stop the authorization," she said. "My channels are compromised. If I escalate through official routes, the contractor company has enough influence to bury it and accelerate the timeline." He looked at the relay tower. "The only clean solution is to remove the data source." "Destroy the relay?" "Yes." She thought about what that meant for her mission. Her orders were to protect the tower. Destroying it would be direct insubordination, potentially criminal. It would end her career. It would likely result in criminal charges under the UCMJ. "I need time," she said. "You have 31 hours. I need to understand the full picture first, and I need to deal with the counter-sniper." Tamir nodded. He looked at the open junction box one more time, then back at her. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "I don't know who authorized your deployment to this position, but whoever it was, I don't think they expected you to look this closely." He walked back toward the comm tent. She stood at the tower base and looked up at the antenna array and thought about 31 hours and the man in the trees to the northeast who had just shot open a padlock to show her what was inside. She got Callahan on a secure channel at 2100. 31 hours, she said. "I heard." He'd been tracking the signals traffic. "I've been running the contractor name through back channels for the last 4 hours. Meridian Strategic Solutions. Private intelligence firm, incorporated in Virginia, significant DoD contracts over the last decade." A pause. "They have people embedded in 3 separate oversight committees, congressional and executive. So official escalation gets buried, yes." He was quiet for a moment. "There's something else." Tell me. I ran the village coordinates against humanitarian organization databases. The population at that location is approximately 340 people, mostly agricultural workers and their families. There's a medical clinic, a school. He paused. The school has 60 students enrolled. She said nothing. Ava, his voice was careful. I know what you're thinking about. Tell me I'm wrong. You're not wrong, he exhaled slowly. But I need you to hear me clearly. You cannot act unilaterally on this without understanding every piece of it first. If you destroy that relay and the coordinate data is somehow backed up elsewhere, if Meridian has a redundant source, you burn your career and the strike happens anyway. So what do? You find the redundancy first. You make sure destroying the tower actually stops it. A pause. And you deal with the sniper. Because as long as he's out there, you can't move freely. She looked out at the dark forest. Somewhere in the northeast quadrant, 490 meters away, a man was lying in the trees watching the same tower she was watching. And they were, apparently, trying to accomplish similar things from opposite directions. I think he's trying to help, she said. Callahan was quiet for a moment. Or he's been instructed to make you think that. I know. She'd been turning that over since the junction box shot. But his behavioral pattern doesn't fit a deception play. If Meridian wanted me neutralized, they had better options than sending a sniper who shoots padlocks open. Unless neutralizing you isn't the goal. Unless the goal is to keep you exactly where you are, watching the relay, managing the threat, doing your job, until the strike window opens. She hadn't thought of it that way. She sat with it for a long moment. You're saying the sniper might be keeping me contained. I'm saying consider all the architectures. He paused. How are your people holding up? She thought about Reyes and the two techs in the comm tent, and the four-person perimeter team who were good soldiers doing their jobs without knowing what those jobs were actually serving. They're solid, she said. They don't know. Keep it that way for now. She signed off and sat in the dark and thought about 340 people in a valley 14 kilometers northeast who had no idea that a relay tower in a mountain forest was currently deciding whether they would wake up in 30 hours. The second contact came at 0230, not from the west this time, from the north, through the ridgeline trail the civilians had been using, which told her the probe the night before had been partly a feint, designed to establish a pattern she'd watch. They'd use the west to make her expect the west. 8 personnel again, different composition, lighter weapons, faster movement, more dispersed spacing. These weren't the same element. A second team, probably inserted that day while she'd been focused on the sniper in Tamir. She keyed the radio before the first shot. Contact north, 8 personnel, 180 meters, moving through the trail corridor. They know the sensor gaps. The camp responded. She worked from her platform, 3 shots, clean, disciplined. The .300 Win Mag doing what it was built for. The element dropped 2 men and scattered, not withdrawing this time but going to ground and holding position. A stalemate at 150 meters. That was new. They weren't probing. They were pinning. She understood the geometry immediately. If the northern element held its ground, she couldn't move freely. She was committed to her overwatch position, covering the camp, while whoever was behind this used the next 29 hours to execute whatever they needed to execute. She shot the man she assessed as the element leader, a judgment call based on his position relative to the others, and the remaining 7 withdrew. Fast. The leadership removal had collapsed the tactical intent, but it had cost her 45 minutes and most of her operational flexibility. When she got Callahan back on the line at 0400, he was already running the pattern. 2 contacts in 48 hours, he said. Both probes, not assaults, and a sniper who's been showing you things instead of shooting you. He paused. Someone is keeping you reactive. I know. Every hour you spend managing contacts is an hour you're not moving on the relay. I know that too. She checked her ammo count, threw her second magazine into her third. The contacts were manageable, but expensive. Someone understands exactly how to pace this. Meridian will have an operational planner on this, someone who's thought through the contingencies. Callahan's voice was tight in a way she rarely heard. Ava, listen to me. They put you here because you're good, not in spite of it. They needed someone credible in that position, someone whose presence would satisfy any oversight review. A competent sniper doing her job, protecting the asset. She processed that. They didn't expect me to look at the data traffic, she said. No, that's not in a standard sniper protection mission profile. He paused. But now that you have looked, they may know. If they're monitoring internal comms, they'd have moved already. Unless they're waiting to see what you do. He let that sit for a moment. Kid, sometimes the mission isn't the mission. And sometimes the mission is to make sure you finish the mission they gave you, not the one you found. She understood. She was the unwitting component, the legitimate cover, and the clock was running. I need to move on this tonight, she said. Tell me what you need. I need to talk to the sniper. A long silence. Ava, he shot open that junction box. He's been showing me things. There's a reason he hasn't taken a kill shot. She kept her voice level. I need to know what he knows, because if Meridian has a backup data source, I need to find it before I take down the relay. Callahan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had something in it she rarely heard. Not quite fear, but its older, quieter cousin. If this goes wrong, he said carefully, I want you to know that I will make sure the truth gets out. Whatever happens to you, I'll make sure it gets out. She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her that he would spend whatever he had left, his reputation, his relationships, his contractor credentials, every connection he'd built over 40 years, to make sure her actions were understood correctly if things went sideways. He was telling her he was already prepared to lose everything to stand behind her decision. Don't do anything stupid on my account, she said. Too late, he said. Already made some calls I can't unmake. A pause. Go find your sniper. At 05:30, the generator died. Not gradually, abruptly, between 1 second and the next, with a metallic clunk that she felt more than heard from her platform. The camp's lights went out. The satellite dish froze mid-rotation. The COM-10's equipment banks dropped to battery backup, which gave them 4 hours of reduced functionality. She didn't need to look for the cause. She knew the cause. The Iranian sniper had been patient for 2 days, shooting cosmetic damage, mapping the array, opening padlocks. Now he decided to accelerate. The generator was a harder shot than the antenna housing, a smaller target, partially shielded by the fuel cache, and he'd taken it cleanly from his established position, which told her he'd been ranging it since the first day. He was moving the timeline. She climbed down from her platform in the pre-dawn dark and moved to the fuel cache. The generator housing had a single entry hole, upper right quadrant. The round had gone through the fuel line and the primary drive assembly. It was not repairable in the field. Without the generator, the relay ran on battery backup. Approximately 6 hours before the satellite uplink failed, the drone feeds would go dark in 3. The legitimate functions of the tower were dying. The secondary data conduit, she checked, was still active, running off its own independent power cell, which she now noticed was concealed inside the junction box that the sniper had opened for her. A separate power source, self-contained. The coordinate transmission would continue after everything else died. She stood at the tower base and ran the math. The sniper had just killed the legitimate cover functions while leaving the malicious function active, which meant one of two things. Either he wanted to expose the coordinate transmission by stripping away everything that had been hiding it, or he was working for Meridian and was accelerating the timeline by removing the obstacles to a clean strike authorization. She needed to know which, and she was running out of time to find out. She made her decision at 0600. She climbed back to her platform, checked her rifle, and broadcast a single transmission on a frequency she'd been saving. Not the tactical net, not the encrypted Callahan channel, but a clear channel frequency that a well-prepared counter-sniper in this sector would be monitoring. "Northeast position," she said. "I know you opened the box. I know what you're showing me. If you want to talk, I'm listening." She waited. For 20 minutes, nothing. Then her earpiece, not her tactical radio, but the secondary receiver she carried as a backup, clicked twice. A recognition signal. He was listening. She said, "I have 30 hours. I need to know if there's a backup data source." A long silence. Then a voice, male, accented. Not the heavy Farsi accent she'd expected, but something more neutral, educated. English that had been learned carefully by someone who'd spent time around native speakers. "There is no backup," the voice said. "The relay is the only transmission node. Meridian ran the secondary conduit through your tower specifically because they needed the U.S. military hardware signature in the data headers. A standalone Iranian intercept wouldn't give them that." She processed that. "Who are you?" she asked. "Someone who has been watching this relay for longer than you have." A pause. "The people in that valley have been there for 4 generations. I have family in the village 2 kilometers north of the target coordinates." She let that land. Then, "You've been trying to stop the strike." "I have been trying to create conditions where someone with the authority to stop it would understand the situation clearly." Another pause. "You are more capable than I expected." "You could have just told me." "I couldn't know if you were part of it." His voice was even, measured. "I had to watch you work first." She understood that. She'd have done the same. "The relay," she said, "if I take it down, the coordinate data dies with it. I have confirmed this through independent monitoring. The data headers require the tower's specific hardware signature to be accepted by the Israeli targeting system. Without that signature, the strike authorization fails technical validation." "And you trust that assessment?" "I built the monitoring apparatus." A beat. "I am not a simple proxy fighter, Staff Sergeant." She believed him. Not because she had any reason to. She had every reason not to. But because the behavioral pattern of the last 3 days was consistent with someone who was precise, patient, and working toward a specific outcome rather than a tactical one. "If I take down the relay," she said, "I'm burning my career." "Yes." "Court-martial, criminal charges under UCMJ." "Possibly." A pause. "I cannot make that easier. I can only tell you what I know." She was quiet for a moment. "The generator," she said. "You killed it deliberately. You're accelerating the timeline." The drone feeds were providing command with real-time imagery of my position. I was becoming visible. A beat. "But yes, also to accelerate. You were moving carefully. Sometimes carefully is not fast enough." She almost said something she decided not to say. Instead, "Pull back to 700 meters. I need to move freely for the next few hours." A pause. "Done. And if this works—" "If this works," he said, "we never spoke. That is better for both of us." The frequency went quiet. She sat with the silence for a moment and then began planning the last phase. She went back into the relay's operational layer at 0800, this time with a clearer map of what she was looking for. The secondary data conduit ran to the junction box. The junction box contained the independent power cell and the actual transmission hardware. A small encrypted module about the size of a hardback book, bolted to the junction box's interior wall. The module's firmware was stamped with a serial number prefix she didn't recognize from military specifications. She photographed everything with her scope camera, made detailed notes on the data format, the power cell specifications, the hardware stamp. Then she went deeper into the traffic logs, not the clean maintenance logs Tamir had shown her, but the raw system logs that recorded every data transaction at the byte level. She'd been in the operational layer before, But she'd been looking at the what. Now she went looking for the when and the who. The secondary conduit had gone active 11 days ago, the same day the tower went live. The firmware on the transmission module had been last updated 6 days ago, 5 days after insertion. A remote update pushed through the satellite uplink during a 40-minute window at 0300 when the camp was at minimum watch and the tech team was asleep. Someone with satellite uplink access had updated the module remotely. She traced the uplink traffic from that window. The update had come from a relay routing node, not a military satellite, but a commercial one. She ran the orbital parameters against commercial satellite registry databases from her tablet and got a match. A communications satellite operated under a lease agreement by a company called Vantage Relay Solutions. She ran Vantage Relay Solutions through her tablet's connection to the Open Intelligence databases. Vantage Relay Solutions was a wholly owned subsidiary of Meridian Strategic Solutions. She sat with that for a moment, then she kept pulling the thread. The commercial satellite had routing access to the tower's uplink because the tower's own technical documentation listed it as a backup relay path, a contingency option in case the primary military satellite experienced outage. That listing had been in the original tower installation specs, the specs that had been drawn up by a joint task force contractor. She pulled the contractor name from the installation specs. Meridian Strategic Solutions. They had installed the tower. They had written the specs. They had given themselves satellite access as a contingency. They had installed the secondary conduit in the transmission module. They had remotely updated the module from their own satellite. And they had fed fake targeting coordinates through the resulting system to manufacture the justification for an airstrike on a civilian settlement. The entire architecture, every layer of it, had been designed and built by the same company that was now benefiting from it. She photographed the raw logs, all of it, every transaction, every timestamp, every routing record. Then she called Callahan. "I have everything," she said, "full documentation, hardware, software, satellite links, remote access logs, timeline." She kept her voice flat. "It's all Meridian, top to bottom." A long pause. "How confident are they in the documentation?" "Confident enough to take it to a federal prosecutor," she paused, "or a journalist, whichever is faster." Callahan was quiet for a moment. She could hear him breathing, slow, deliberate, the way he breathed when he was making a decision he'd already made, but was taking the time to make sure. "I've already sent a package to 3 people," he said, 2 journalists and a Senate aide on the Armed Services Committee. "Your raw data just became the evidence layer." A pause. "I told you I'd made some calls I couldn't unmake." She understood now what those calls had cost him. He'd gone outside official channels. He'd contacted journalists. For a man with his career history and his clearances, that was an act of professional self-immolation. He'd done it before she'd even confirmed the full picture. He'd trusted her read of the situation. "Jack," she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name in months. "Don't," he said, but not unkindly. "Save it for when this is done." A pause. "How much time?" 26 hours to the strike window. She looked at the relay tower. "I can end it tonight." "What do you need?" "Nothing. I have everything I need." She paused. "But I need you to understand. If this goes sideways, the documentation is the only thing that matters. The story has to get out." "It'll get out." His voice was certain in a way that steadied her. "I promise you that." She spent 4 hours after that transmission in her platform, lying still, watching the canopy, doing nothing. Not because she was paralyzed, because she was thinking. She had 3 options in 26 hours, and the weight of each option was specific and real in a way that decision trees and mission planning documents never captured. Option 1, follow her orders, protect the relay, file a report through official channels about the coordinate data. Trust the chain of command to act on the information before the strike window. The clean option, the legal option, the option that preserved her career and her standing and her future. She discarded it. Not because she didn't believe in chains of command. She'd spent her adult life operating inside one and understood its value. She discarded it because Callahan had already told her what happened when you escalated against Meridian through official channels. And Tamir had confirmed it from his side, and the raw system logs had shown her exactly how deep the company's fingers were in the institutional architecture. Official channels were compromised, had been compromised from before she'd arrived. Option 2, go to the sniper's approach. Degrade the relay progressively, kill the secondary conduit's power cell, destroy the transmission module, leave the tower physically standing but functionally unable to transmit the coordinate data. Surgical, deniable. She could claim insurgent sabotage. The physical damage would be consistent with enemy action. She sat with this one longer. It was tempting because it was clever, and she recognized that as a reason to distrust it. Clever was what you chose when you were trying to avoid the honest version of a hard decision. The transmission module could be replaced. If Meridian had the capability to push remote firmware updates, they had the capability to push replacement hardware through other channels. A surgical fix would buy time, not permanence. Option 3, destroy the relay entirely. Tower down, all transmission capability eliminated. The coordinate data dies. The strike authorization fails validation. 340 people in a valley northeast go to sleep tomorrow night without knowing how close it came. And she goes home to a court-martial. She lay in her platform and looked up through the forest canopy at the pale sky and thought about the people she'd been in this job. The person she'd been at Fort Bragg learning to shoot, who'd believed unambiguously in the chain of command and the rightness of orders, and the idea that the institution was larger and wiser than any individual within it. The person she'd been in her first deployment, who'd started to see the gap between the institution's stated values and its operational realities. The person she was now, lying in a tree platform in a mountain forest, holding documentation that proved a private American company had built a false flag architecture to manufacture the justification for killing 340 people for pipeline access. She thought about what Callahan had said. Sometimes the mission isn't the mission. And she thought about what the sniper had said. I had to watch you work first. Both of them had made their own calculations about her and come to the same conclusion. She was the variable that could change the outcome, not because of her rifle or her training or her access to the relay, but because she'd looked when she could have not looked, and she'd kept looking when she could have stopped, and she'd chosen to understand the full picture even when understanding it made the decision harder. She thought about the school with 60 students. Then she stopped thinking and started planning. The relay would come down tonight, not because she was certain it was the right choice in some absolute moral framework, but because she was the person in this forest with the information and the capability to act on it. And walking away from that responsibility, hiding behind the comfort of orders and legal cover, was its own kind of choice. The kind that 60 children in a school and 280 other people in a valley would pay for. She keyed her radio. Callahan, I'm here. Tonight, after second dark, I need extraction in 6 hours from the primary LZ. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. I'll have a bird there, he said. Whatever it costs. She signed off and began preparing her equipment for the last phase of an operation that had never been what she'd been told it was. End of part 2. Word count, approximately 8,650 words. She had 7 hours before the window opened. She used them. At 1400, she came down from the platform and moved through the camp with the careful deliberateness of someone who understood that the next 6 hours were a sequence of irreversible decisions. First, she went to the comm tent and spent 40 minutes with the senior tech, asking questions she framed as routine maintenance inquiries. She wanted to know the exact battery backup duration for each system, the shutdown sequence, which components would retain data after power loss, and whether any of the tower's systems had automatic reporting functions that would flag sudden termination. The tech answered everything without suspicion. He was good at his job. He thought she was doing hers. She learned 3 things she needed. The satellite uplink would send an automated status report to the Joint Task Force Operations Center at 2100. She needed to act before that window, or the report would include anomalous readings that would trigger a response team before she was clear. The tower's internal data drives were formatted to wipe automatically if physical damage exceeded a certain threshold. That threshold was calibrated for fire, not ballistic impact. So a precision shot would need to hit a specific structural junction to trigger the wipe sequence. And the transmission module in the junction box had its own automated backup that would send a status ping to the Meridian satellite every 6 hours. The next ping was at 2230. She had a window between 2100 and 2230 that was clean on both ends. She thanked the tech and left the comm tent. Second, she found Reyes at the fuel cache, working on the generator with tools and the specific optimism of someone who hadn't yet accepted that the machine was dead. "Leave it," she said. He looked up. "I think I can get it running. If I bypass the Reyes." She waited until she had his full attention. "Leave it. I need you to focus on the perimeter tonight. Full alert posture from 1900 onward. Rotate your team so nobody is below 60% rest. I want clear fields of fire to the west and north." He studied her for a moment. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. "What are you expecting tonight?" he asked. "Probably nothing," she said. "But I want the team positioned as if we're expecting something significant." She paused. "If things get confusing after dark, if you hear shots from inside the perimeter or the tower goes down, I need your team to hold position and not engage until you have positive identification. Do you understand?" He understood. She could see him absorbing the implication that the threat might not come from outside the wire. He was smart enough not to say that out loud. "Understood, Staff Sergeant," he said. "Good man." She left him at the generator and moved to the north side of the perimeter, where the tree line was thickest. She stood there for 10 minutes, looking into the forest, thinking about the man who was out there at 700 meters, watching her prepare. She wondered if he was thinking about her the same way she was thinking about him. 2 people on opposite sides of a dozen different lines, national, institutional, operational, who had arrived at the same conclusion through different paths and were now, in some functional sense, working toward the same outcome from their respective positions. She thought about what he'd said. "I had to watch you work first." She had spent 3 days being watched and hadn't known it until he chose to reveal it. That bothered her less than it probably should have. If she'd been in his position, monitoring an operation with this much at stake, trying to determine whether the American sniper deployed to protect the compromise relay was part of the compromise or a genuine unknown, she'd have done the same thing. You didn't reveal your hand until you were certain of the other player. He'd been certain of her before she'd been certain of herself. She went back to her platform and began the long wait for dark. The forest at night had a different grammar than the forest in daylight. By day, it communicated in movement, branches, birds, the faint displacement of undergrowth by things moving through it. By night, it communicated in sound and the absence of sound, in the way ambient noise shifted when something changed in the immediate environment. She'd been reading it for 3 days now, and she understood its rhythms well enough to feel when something was different. At 1930, the birds stopped. Not gradually, together, abruptly, the way they go quiet when a predator moves through. She scanned the northern approach without shifting her body weight and saw nothing. But the silence held for 4 minutes before the forest resumed its normal evening conversation, which told her something had moved through the 200 to 300-meter range band to the north and was now past it, moving away. The second contact element, repositioning for tonight. She keyed the radio. Reyes, contact indicator north, 200 to 300 meters. No visual confirmation, but birds went quiet at 1930. Possible element repositioning. Copy. I've got 2 people covering that sector. Good. Hold positions. Weapons tight until visual confirmation. She went back to watching and waiting. At 2015, she ran her final equipment check. Rifle, full magazine, round-chambered, suppressor tight. Sidearm, full, safety on. Dimension tablet, fully charged, documentation backed up to 3 separate encrypted locations she'd established over the afternoon using the tower's satellite uplink before the battery ran too low. Callahan had copies. The journalists had copies. The Senate aide had copies. Whatever happened in the next 2 hours, the documentation would survive her. At 2040, she climbed down from the platform for the last time. She moved to the tower base, staying in the shadows of the guy wire anchors, and knelt beside the junction box. The transmission module was still running. The power cell indicator showed green. On her tablet, she could see the coordinate data still transmitting, steady, patient, indifferent to everything that had happened around it. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked up at the relay tower itself. 40 feet of aluminum in the dark. The satellite dish frozen in position since the generator died. The antenna array carrying its invisible cargo of corrupted data out towards satellites she'd never see. She thought about the 11 days it had been running, thought about the people who had planned this, who had made decisions in offices and boardrooms that they would never have to be present for the consequences of. She thought about the school. She stood up, retrieved her rifle, and began calculating the shot sequence. Then at 20:55, movement on the south approach, faint, deliberate, the kind that didn't belong to wind or animals. She went still and watched for 90 minutes before she was certain it had passed. By then the window had closed. She reset her timeline and waited for the next one. It came at 2:17, not from the northwest, where she'd been watching, not from the north, where Reyes had 2 people covering the trail corridor. It came from directly beneath the relay tower, a concussion that punched upward through the guy wire anchors and traveled through 30 meters of pine trunk and hit her platform like a fist. She was already moving when the perimeter lights died. The IED had been planted at the tower base. Not tonight, not while she'd been watching. Days ago, before her insertion, by someone who had known exactly where the structural weak points were. She understood that in the half-second it took her to get her rifle up and her eye to the scope. The tower was swaying, not collapsing, swaying. The charge had been sized to destabilize, not destroy. Someone wanted the tower damaged, not dead. In her thermal, 12 heat signatures pushing out of the western tree line. Disciplined spacing, moving fast, converging on the tower base from 2 angles. Not a probe this time, a retrieval operation. They were coming for the transmission module. She keyed her radio. Reyes, contact west and southwest, 12 personnel, moving on the tower. Do not let them reach the base. Then the crack came, 6 inches from her scope housing. The branch beside her left ear disintegrated into splinters, and she felt the displaced air on her cheek. The specific, intimate nearness of a round that had been aimed, not suppressed. She dropped flat against the platform, pine bark against her chin, heart running hard and controlled. The Iranian sniper, but not from the northeast. He'd moved, repositioned during the 4 hours she'd been preparing. He was somewhere south now, at elevation, and he'd just put a round close enough to her face to make a point without ending the conversation. Her earpiece clicked twice. His signal. The same double click from 3 days ago. She pressed flat and spoke into her secondary receiver, keeping her voice below the level of the firefight building below. That was close. Intentional. His voice was tight in a way it hadn't been before. There is a third element. Not Meridian's proxy fighters. Direct contractors. 6 men, Western trained, here for the transmission module. They will extract it and reestablish the data feed from a secondary location within 48 hours. She processed that fast. Meridian has a contingency. They always had a contingency. I was wrong about the backup. A pause that carried the weight of a man admitting something that cost him. I am sorry. I told you the relay was the only node. Where are they? Already inside your perimeter. They came through the south approach during the IED detonation, 2 minutes ago. She looked down through the platform gap. The camp below was chaos. Reyes engaging the western element, the perimeter team laying fire into the tree line, the comm tent dark. In the confusion of the explosion and the contact, 6 men in contractor kit had walked through the south approach while everyone was looking west. Her camp, her people, her mission. Callahan, she said on the encrypted channel. I heard it. I'm watching the drone feed. Wait, your drone went dark. A pause. What's your status? Compromised perimeter south side. 6 direct contractors moving on the transmission module. She was already moving down the platform ladder, controlled and fast. The module gets extracted. The strike happens from a new location. How long do you have? She hit the ground and pressed into the shadow of the tree trunk, scanning. Minutes. Ava. His voice was stripped down to something essential. The bird is 30 minutes out. Whatever you're going to do it now. She moved toward the tower. She came around the northeast corner of the tower base and saw 2 of them, both in dark kit, no insignia, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this kind of work before in other places. One was at the junction box, hands inside, working fast. The other was covering the approach, weapon up, watching the firefight at the western perimeter without looking back. She shot the covering man first. The suppressor kept it quiet enough that the man at the junction box didn't immediately register what had happened. He turned at the sound of his partner dropping, and she was already moving. Not shooting, moving, closing distance, because she needed him alive long enough to ask one question. She didn't get the chance. He came up fast with a sidearm and she went sideways, and the round clipped the guy wire anchor 2 feet from her hip. She hit him with the rifle stock, a controlled strike, not a killing blow, and he went down hard, and she put her knee on his weapon hand and her muzzle at his throat. The contingency site, she said. Where? He looked up at her, 40 years old maybe, professional face, the kind of man who had made calculations about acceptable risk for a long time. You don't stop this, he said. You know that. Where? He said nothing. She heard movement behind her. The remaining 4 contractors closing from the south approach, 30 seconds away at most. Below her knee, the man's weapon hand was still. He was waiting for his team. She made the decision in under a second. She stood, stepped back, and shot the transmission module. 1 round into the junction box at close range, through the power cell, through the encrypted module, through the fiber termination point. The green indicator light on the power cell died. The coordinate transmission flatlined on her tablet screen. The data headers that Meridian needed, the specific U.S. military hardware signature that the Israeli targeting system required for validation, gone. Not the tower, just the module. Step 1, the only step she had time for, with 4 men 30 seconds out. It wouldn't hold forever. Meridian would rebuild. But right now, at 2:23 on a Thursday morning, the strike authorization had just lost its technical validation, and the window was closing. The man on the ground looked at the ruined junction box, then at her. 48 hours, he said. We'll have a new node up in 48 hours. Then someone will deal with it in 48 hours, she said. Tonight it's done. She heard the 4 contractors coming, and she ran. She went north through the camp at a dead sprint, through the gap between the canvas structures, past the fuel cache, toward the tree line where the northern approach was still theoretically clear. Behind her, 3 shots from the contractors, suppressed, close. One hit the fuel cache housing, and she felt the impact vibration through the ground. She made the tree line and went up. Not a platform, just a tree, the nearest one with branches low enough to climb fast. And she went up 15 meters in 30 seconds, the way she'd learned to climb before she'd learned to shoot. She pressed into the trunk and controlled her breathing and looked down. The contractors had stopped at the tree line edge. Smart. Going into dark forest after a sniper was not the calculation they were paid to make. She watched them regroup. 4 men at the tree line, 2 back at the tower base with the ruined junction box and their dead colleagues. The Western contact, Meridian's proxy fighters, was withdrawing now that the mission had failed. Reyes and the perimeter team were holding. Then a voice in her secondary earpiece. North Ridge, 80 meters, move now. The Iranian sniper. She moved north through the canopy, branch to branch, low and fast, navigating by the map she'd built over 3 days in this forest. 80 meters to the North Ridge. She covered it in 4 minutes. He was there. She almost didn't see him. He was that good. He was pressed into a fork of pine branches 15 meters up, ghillie suit fragmenting his outline into the canopy pattern. And she only found him because he moved one hand to signal her position. She climbed to his level and pressed into the adjacent fork, and for a moment they were 2 snipers in the same tree, looking down at the same camp from opposite sides. She looked at him directly for the first time. He was older than she'd expected, late 40s, maybe 50, deep-set eyes, deliberate face. The rifle across his lap was a custom platform, not Iranian military issue, something built for precision work. He looked at her the way people look at someone they have been watching from a distance and are finally seeing close. The module is destroyed? He asked. Yes. He nodded once. Then he raised his rifle and shot, not at her, past her, down into the camp. She spun and saw one of the contractors at the tree line edge drop his weapon and go down. A leg shot, non-fatal. The remaining 3 scattered back toward the south approach. That buys you 10 minutes, he said. My extraction is 20 minutes out. I know. He was already moving, unhooking from the fork, preparing to descend the opposite side of the ridge. There is a vehicle at the northeast logging road. My people. They will not interfere with your extraction. She watched him. Your family, in the village north of the coordinates. He paused. They are safe tonight, he said, because you made a decision. She thought about the right thing to say to that and didn't find it, which was probably correct. The contingency site, she said instead. Meridian's 48-hour rebuild. Do you know where it is? A pause. I have a location. I cannot act on it alone. Send it to this frequency. She gave him the encrypted channel. Callahan will make sure it gets to people who can. He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone recalibrating a judgment they'd already made. You are more than I expected, he said, when I first saw you arrive. You watched me get off the helicopter. I watch everything. He almost smiled. It was a brief thing, barely there. Go, Staff Sergeant. Your bird is coming. He descended into the dark on the other side of the ridge and was gone in 30 seconds, absorbed back into the forest as completely as if he'd never been there. She turned south and moved toward the LZ. She came back through the camp perimeter at 0241. Reyes was at the western wire with his team, consolidating after the contact. 2 of the contractors were still at the tower base. She could see them through her nods, standing over the ruined junction box, not moving, not threatening. They'd made their assessment of the situation, and it had come up negative. She walked past them. She walked to the relay tower and stood at its base for the last time, looking up at the antenna array. The satellite dish was still frozen in its last position. The frequency hop transmitters were still running on battery, broadcasting to nobody. The legitimate feeds had all gone dark when the generator died. The tower was a 40-foot aluminum skeleton transmitting ghost signals into the sky. She put 3 rounds into the base of the tower's structural junction, the specific point the senior tech had told her about, the threshold that would trigger the internal data wipe. The aluminum folded at the joint with a sound like a ship's hull under stress, a long metallic groan that traveled up through the structure. The tower didn't fall immediately, it leaned. Then the guy wires on the north side snapped under the redistributed load. 1, 2, 3, a sequence of sharp reports like rifle shots, and the whole structure came down in a slow, deliberate arc, the antenna array tracing a pale line through the dark sky before it hit the earth with a crash that shook the ground under her feet and sent pine branches raining down across the camp. The satellite dish landed 12 feet from where she was standing. She looked at the wreckage for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the LZ. The radio came back online at 02:54. The battery backup on the tactical net still had charge even after the tower went down. The JTF Operations Center was already calling. She answered on the 3rd transmission because letting it ring longer would have looked like evasion. Overwatch, this is Ops Center. We are showing total loss of relay asset. What is your status? Ops Center, Overwatch. Relay destroyed during multi-element insurgent assault. IED at tower base followed by direct contractor assault on communications equipment. Transmission module destroyed to prevent asset capture. Tower brought down to deny salvage. She kept her voice flat and even, the voice of a soldier filing a contact report. 3 enemy KIA confirmed at the wire. 1 enemy WIA at the tree line. Friendly casualties, 0. A long pause from Ops Center. Overwatch, confirm. You destroyed the relay asset? Confirmed. Asset was compromised and under direct threat of capture. Destruction was the tactically correct decision to prevent hostile exploitation. Another pause. Longer this time. Overwatch, stand by for senior officer. She stood by. The senior officer who came on the line had the voice of a man who had been woken up and was not pleased about it. He ran through the standard accountability questions, timeline, threat assessment, decision authority, and she answered each one with the same flat accuracy. She had made a field decision under direct enemy assault to deny a compromised asset to hostile forces. It was within her operational authority. It was the correct decision. She did not mention the coordinate data. She did not mention Meridian. She did not mention the transmission module or the junction box or the 340 people in the Valley Northeast who were asleep right now without any idea how close it had come. Those facts were in the documentation. The documentation was with Callahan and with 2 journalists and with a Senate aide on the Armed Services Committee. The facts would find their way into the light through the right channels, on a timeline that didn't depend on her telling a compromised chain of command things they already knew and didn't want confirmed. You'll be required to submit a full written report upon extraction, the senior officer said. Understood, she said. And Overwatch, you should be aware that questions will be asked about this decision. I expect so, she said. I'm prepared to answer them. The radio went quiet. She kept walking toward the LZ. The helicopter came in at 0309, not a standard military bird, a civilian model, non-markings, running dark. Callahan's bird. She saw it before she heard it, a shape against the slightly lighter sky above the ridge, descending fast toward the logging road clearing she designated as descending fast toward the logging road clearing she designated for extraction. She ran the last 200 meters. Callahan was in the helicopter. She hadn't expected that. He was sitting in the rear with his jacket collar up against the rotor wash, looking older than she remembered from the last time she'd seen him in person. 3 years ago at Fort Bragg, when she'd finished her advanced sniper qualification, and he'd been there to watch. He was 62 years old, and he looked at tonight in a way he hadn't 3 years ago. And she understood without him saying it that the calls he'd made in the last 24 hours had cost him something that couldn't be measured in career terms alone. She climbed in. The helicopter lifted immediately. "The module?" he asked. "Destroyed. Towers down." He nodded. His hands were folded in his lap with the stillness of a man who had been waiting a long time and was now absorbing the information that the wait was over. "The contingency site," she said. "The sniper is sending coordinates to the encrypted channel. 48-hour rebuild window." Callahan reached into his jacket and produced a satellite phone. "Already being handled." He paused. "The Senate aide has been on the phone for 2 hours. Once I sent the documentation package, things started moving faster than I expected." "How fast?" "Fast enough that Meridian's DoD contracts are going to be under a hold order by morning." He looked at her. "The journalists are running the story in 48 hours regardless of what anyone does to stop it. I made sure of that before I sent the documentation." She looked out the window at the dark forest receding below. The relay station was invisible from here. Just forest, dense and lightless, the wreckage swallowed by canopy and dark. In 8 hours it would be dawn over the valley northeast, and 340 people would wake up and make breakfast and send their children to school and have no idea. "The contractors at the camp," she said, "the ones who came for the module." "I have names." He said it simply, without elaboration, in the tone of a man who had spent 40 years in the machinery of military intelligence and knew exactly what to do with names. "They won't be a problem." She leaned her head back against the helicopter frame and felt the vibration of the rotors through her skull and thought about the senior officer on the radio and the written report she would have to file and the questions that would be asked and the UCMJ process that was likely already being considered by someone in a building she'd never been inside. "This is going to be a long few months," she said. "Yes." Callahan was quiet for a moment. "I've retained a lawyer, a good one. He's worked defense cases for special operations personnel before." He paused. "He's already been briefed on the documentation." She turned to look at him. "When did you retain him?" 2 days ago." He met her eyes with the direct steadiness she'd known for 6 years. "When I understood what you were walking toward." She held his gaze for a moment. "You burned everything," she said. "Your contracts, your clearances, everything you built after you retired." "I built those things to be useful," he said. "Tonight they were useful." He looked out the window. "I'm 62 years old. I don't need another contract. I need to be able to sleep." She said nothing to that because there was nothing to say that wouldn't diminish it. The helicopter flew north in the dark, carrying 2 people who had both spent the last 48 hours making decisions they couldn't unmake, toward a morning that would require them to stand behind those decisions in rooms full of people who had very good reasons to want a different story. She filed the written report 9 hours later from a forward support base 80 kilometers north of the relay station site. It was 4 pages, single-spaced, precise, and entirely accurate in every tactical detail. The IED at 217, the multi-element assault, the direct contractor threat to the transmission module, the destruction of the module to prevent hostile capture, the demolition of the tower to deny salvage. Every statement in the report was true. The report contained no mention of coordinate data, junction boxes, Meridian strategic solutions, pipeline routes, or Israeli strike authorizations. Those facts existed in a different document, filed with different people, moving through different channels. The official report said what the official report needed to say. She signed it, submitted it, and went to find coffee. A captain from the JTF legal office found her 20 minutes later. He was young, formal, and had the expression of someone delivering a message he hadn't written. "Staff Sergeant Carter, I've been directed to inform you that a formal review of your actions on the night of—" "I know," she said. He paused. You're entitled to legal representation during... I have representation. She drank her coffee. Thank you, Captain. He left. She stood at the window of the support-based mess hall and looked out at the flat, heat-white landscape north of the forest and thought about the valley she'd never seen, 14 kilometers northeast of a relay station that no longer existed, where the morning was already several hours old. Her phone buzzed. A message from Callahan, 2 words, story running. She put the phone in her pocket and finished her coffee. 41 hours after the relay came down, a story ran on the front page of 2 national newspapers simultaneously. She didn't read it. She heard about it from the lawyer Callahan had retained, who called her at 700 on the second morning and spent 11 minutes explaining what was in the story and what it meant for her case, and what it meant for the formal review process, and what it meant for Meridian Strategic Solutions, which had, as of 0630 that morning, had its primary DoD contract suspended pending investigation. She asked one question. The strike authorization, is it formally canceled? Canceled and referred to a joint oversight board for investigation. A pause. The Israeli government has issued a statement confirming they were acting on intelligence they believe to be validated. They've opened their own inquiry. She said thank you and ended the call and sat with that for a long moment. Not celebration. She didn't feel celebration. She felt the particular flat tiredness of someone who had been running on adrenaline and purpose for 72 hours and was now standing in a quiet room with nothing immediate left to do, and the body's accounting of what that had cost was coming due. She thought about Reyes and his perimeter team, who had held the Western Wire through 2 contact engagements without knowing what they were actually defending. She thought about the 2 technicians in the comm tent who had answered her questions about battery backup without suspicion because they trusted her, and who would now be interviewed as part of the formal review. She thought about Tamir, who had made his own impossible decision when he decided to tell her what he knew rather than manage the situation through his own channels. She thought about Tamir and whether his chain had treated his disclosure as courage or insubordination, and decided she would probably never know, and that this was its own kind of answer. She thought about the man in the trees, who had a family in a village 2 kilometers north of coordinates that no longer existed in any active targeting system, and who was now gone back into whatever life he'd come from, carrying a 3-day operation that would never appear in any official record. She wondered if he'd slept. 3 weeks later, she was assigned to a desk at Fort Bragg, pending the outcome of the formal review. It wasn't punishment, not officially. It was administrative necessity, which everyone understood to mean the same thing, while the legal process worked itself out. She had an office with a window that looked out at the parade ground, and a stack of reading material that constituted her duties for the foreseeable future, and a lawyer who called every 2 days with updates that were gradually trending in a direction she was cautiously reading as positive. Callahan visited on a Thursday afternoon. He looked better than he had in the helicopter, rested, or at least restored to his baseline, which was a version of rested she'd come to understand over 6 years of knowing him. He brought coffee and sat across from her desk, and they talked for 2 hours about nothing operational, which was its own kind of debrief. Near the end, he said, "The Senate committee has requested the full documentation for a closed hearing. That's scheduled for next month." "I know," the lawyer told me. "You'll be asked to testify." "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating steadiness he'd had since she'd first met him. The gaze of a man who had been watching people perform under pressure for 4 decades and had developed a precise sense of what they were made of. "You did the right thing," he said. She thought about that. Not whether it was true. She'd made her peace with the decision in the helicopter, coming north through the dark. She thought about what the statement meant coming from him, a man who had spent his career inside the machinery of an institution that he'd served faithfully and understood completely, including its capacity for the kind of institutional corruption she'd found in a junction box in a Lebanese mountain forest. He wasn't telling her it had been easy. He wasn't telling her it would be consequence-free. He was telling her something narrower and more important, that the decision had been correct, and that he had been watching her work long enough to be certain of that, and that his certainty was worth something. "I know," she said. He nodded once, the way he nodded when a conversation had arrived at the place it needed to arrive. Outside the window, the parade ground was empty in the afternoon light. A September afternoon at Fort Bragg, warm and ordinary, the kind of afternoon that had no relationship to mountain forests and ruined relay towers and the invisible arithmetic of decisions made in the dark. She thought about what she'd learned in 3 days in that forest. Not tactics, not tradecraft. She'd known those going in. What she'd learned was something she didn't have precise words for yet, something about the relationship between accuracy and judgment, and which one was harder to sustain over time. She'd been a sniper long enough to know that accuracy was a technical problem. You trained, you qualified, you performed. The parameters were measurable, the standards were clear. Judgment was different. Judgment operated in conditions where the parameters shifted and the standards were contested, and the people who set the standards had interests that weren't always the same as the interests the standards were supposed to serve. Judgment was what you were left with when the mission turned out not to be the mission, and the chain of command turned out not to be the chain. And the only fixed point in the entire architecture was the thing you understood to be true, and the decision you were willing to make because of it. She looked at the parade ground and thought about a village in a valley she'd never seen, going about its Thursday afternoon. "What's next?" Callahan asked. She considered the question. "The review finishes," she said. "Then I go back to work." He smiled at that, a brief, real thing, the smile of a man who had known her long enough to find it exactly right. "Good," he said. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the parade ground in the slow way that light moves, when there's nothing urgent happening, and nobody is watching the sky for threat signatures, and the forest is somewhere else entirely, quiet and deep, and full of things that only reveal themselves to people patient enough to stay still and wait. She picked up her coffee. There was reading to do.